Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. That word justice packs a wallop. It's such a central value, and the Justice Department plays such an extraordinary and powerful role in our government and in our society. Right now, the Justice Department is in crisis, and its independence and its fealty to the rule of law are really under threat in ways we have not seen in a long time. Robert Jackson was a legendary leader of the Justice Department. He actually later on was the U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials and a Supreme Court justice. And he gave a famous speech to young attorneys that people still learn about today that's very relevant to what's going on right now. He said prosecutors have tremendous discretion. They can have citizens investigated. They can go before a grand jury in secret. He said, while prosecutors at their best are some of the most beneficent forces in society, when they act from malice or other base motives, they can be some of the worst. We're seeing that play out very much in real time today. We see at the Justice Department, this agency with such extraordinary power and such an important role and so many risks of abuse, being undermined in its own commitment to the rule of law under this administration. We think it's really important to unpack this, to understand it, to understand why so many senior attorneys and veterans of the Justice Department from both parties are very concerned, and to talk about what we can do about it now and in the future. We are extraordinarily fortunate to be joined for this conversation by two former leaders of the Justice Department and leading voices on the rule of law in our country. Peter Keisler was acting Attorney General of the United States under George W. Bush and served as head of the Civil Division of the Justice Department. He was a longtime partner at Sidley Austin and is active today in the fight for the rule of law. And Vanita Gupta was Associate Attorney General under President Biden and head of the Civil Division under President Obama, and also worked with us as leader of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. And I should disclose to all of you that they are both on the board of the Brennan Center. Thank you both for being here. It goes without saying, you served presidents of both parties, but you're both very concerned about the Justice Department, what has happened to it, and what we need to do to make sure that it once again can live up to its vital role. And I'm wondering, for those who are not as steeply versed in this, why is the Justice Department important, and why is it important that it have these standards? Peter, can we start with you?
Sure. I think there are two big picture things that people should understand. The first is that the Justice Department plays, a whole host of critical functions across the government that range from public safety functions like dealing with violent crime and counterterrorism and national security and cybersecurity. It has a critical role in protecting individual and civil rights, and it's the department in government that tries to keep everybody else as well as itself in the government acting within the law. So, I think everybody has an interest in making sure that the Justice Department is functioning as skillfully and effectively and professionally as possible, because insofar as its capabilities are degraded through acts of self-sabotage, which is something we're seeing now, then we're all less safe in a bunch of different ways. And the other thing to know is that precisely because it plays all these critical roles, the department is given immense power. And that's particularly so when it's performing its criminal justice functions. That's the power to surveil, it's the power to arrest, it's the power to detain, it's the power to seek charges against people. That's extremely important, and it's very beneficial when it's used properly. But if it's misused, that's the power to coerce, it's the power to benefit your friends with huge benefits and punish your enemies with very significant consequences. It's the power to hurt people's reputations and even potentially deprive them of their liberty. So you have this cabinet department, which is critical in a variety of ways, has been vested with a lot of power, and therefore really has to be run well.
Vanita, how do you see it?
very much the same as Peter. I think people don't often understand that actually the work of the department touches real people in real communities, in every community across the country. And it's for all of the reasons that Peter said. It's the public safety function, it's the national security function, but it's also the work that the Justice Department does to ensure that companies don't have monopolies and raise prices on airline tickets, on the food that we buy at the grocery store. To make sure that people have an opportunity to and equal access to the types of jobs that they need to feed their families and to have healthy and thriving lives. There's so much work that the department does that touches real people in real communities every day. And then to Peter's point, there's also just this very big role that it plays in our legal system. It's the only cabinet agency named after a value, justice, and the ability to take people's life and liberty is something that the department has. And so the need to ensure that the leadership and that the men and women who make up the department are always guided by this North Star of seeking justice is something that, for decades, regardless of whether it was a Republican president or a Democratic president, appointing the AG and the leadership at the department was something that was taken, incredibly seriously. And I think the reason why Peter and I are working so hard and are somewhat alarmed about what's happening right now with the department is out of a concern around the degradation of that very value set that has for decades motivated the men and women who work in the department. And the larger threat that poses to the rule of law in this country. So, again, it's bread and butter for the things that you and I rely on for our families, but it's also some of these, bigger principles at stake that could have real life consequences for the life and liberty of people around the country as well.
I never worked at the Justice Department, but I'm really struck when I talk to people who do work there or who have been leaders there, just how deep this ethos is of the need to act responsibly and to follow the rule of law and not just follow political dictates and whims, partly because of the important role and partly because of the tremendous potential for abuse. It's pretty clear, and you've both argued very strongly, that what is happening now under this administration is not business as usual. It is different, and it really poses great threats to the rule of law in the country because of the institutional challenges at the Justice Department. I'd like to go through in a little bit what some of these are to unpack it, so that again we can really understand the particular challenges that are happening. The first and sort of most visible challenge to the independence of the Justice Department and the misuse of the awesome power of criminal prosecution is the very explicit goal of using the Justice Department for vengeance and to go after President Trump's political enemies. Is this unusual? I'm going to ask the kind of naive questions. There's always a lot of political issues in prosecutions, but why is this unusual, and what particular examples, whether prosecutions or non-prosecutions, really tell the story?
Well, I think there are two sides of the same coin, because the coin here is taking the criminal law enforcement process and harnessing it to be used for political or personal ends, and the two sides are helping your friends and getting your enemies. And on the helping your friends side, that started on the very first day of the administration, when everybody who had been convicted in connection with January 6th was pardoned. These included people who had committed some of the most brutal imaginable acts, beating police officers with flagpoles, all pardoned. And the thing about it is, everybody understands that if these people had engaged in exactly the same behavior, but had done so in a rally against the president rather than in support of him, they never would have been pardoned. So the only way to understand that, and again, from day one, was sparing some very bad people from the consequences of their actions simply because they were supporters of the president. And, that aspect of things has continued pretty uninterrupted. We saw, Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, who had been charged with very serious acts of public corruption, essentially charged with selling his office. And those charges were dismissed, even though the person at the Justice Department, Emil Bovey, who directed that they be dismissed, said he had conducted no analysis of the facts or the law in the case and wasn't basing that instruction on any such analysis. It was just that Mayor Adams had said he would agree to help the president implement the president's immigration priorities. And so if those allegations against him were true, then you have somebody who'd engaged in serious public corruption, again, being spared the consequences. But, in some ways, the most sort of striking and open example to me is in some ways also the most trivial, which is that last week the president pardoned George Santos. Now, George Santos is a relatively small-scale con man, but in addition to the fact that he had met none of the criteria for a pardon, he had only just recently been sentenced and served only a fraction of his sentence. He had shown no remorse. There was no question about his guilt. The president pardoned him, and when he pardoned him, he said in all caps, it was in part because George Santos always votes Republicans. Triple exclamation point. And that was as open an admission than anyone could make, that the criminal justice system was now about rewarding friends and punishing enemies. And I think, the reason it's so open is that it isn't only about helping his friends. It's about making more friends. It's about advertising to everybody that if you are out there and you are allying yourself with the president, then the criminal justice system is going to do its work for you. And if you are on the other side, like Jim Comey or Letitia James, then it's going to happen in reverse. And we could talk about that too, but why don't I stop now and turn it over to Vanita?
Well, it's everything Peter said. I mean, I think the prosecutions of Jim Comey and Letitia James are a very kind of visible demonstration of the retribution agenda and the way that the department is being weaponized for the president's retribution agenda. What I think this is not just I think those prosecutions in some ways are the tip of the spear, because there's a lot of other things happening in the department and that really go to the deployment of the department to go after not just individuals who may have criticized the president and the administration. And Peter laid out, some of the most key examples of that. But there's a lot of concern right now around the administration's pursuit of organizations that are holding the administration to account in the courts to protect the rule of law, that may be engaging in dissent against the administration, that may be very involved in trying to ensure a free and fair election coming up. There's been a lot of words from the president and the administration around pursuit of, quote, left organizations pursuing a leftist agenda, and I use that in quotes. After the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk, the administration has put out executive orders and presidential memorandums that really do appear to put a target on organizations engaging in dissent. Now, this is fundamentally American bread and butter, First Amendment protected activity. Obviously, any organization that is going to be condoning or promoting violence, like there are laws on the books for to ensure that there's accountability for that type of thing. There are tax laws on the books to ensure that organizations have tax exempt status do not engage in partisan activity. But what I think people aren't necessarily focusing on is the net. The net has been cast much wider than some of the more high profile folks that the federal government has gone after. And that right now there's a lot of concern that the kind of ecosystem and infrastructure that exists to protect the rule of law, that has held Democratic administration and presidents accountable to Republican administrations and presidents accountable, that this Department of Justice and other parts of the federal government are essentially getting deployed to go after First Amendment protected activity. And, I have been heartened that we saw, Senator Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson speak up for the First Amendment when the FTC, engaged in threats against Jimmy Kimmel, and that whole episode took place. We've got to understand that, this type of activity you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube once this happens. But there are very serious threats and concerns right now about where the Justice Department could be deployed. They're using the False Claims Act right now in unprecedented ways to go after universities engaging in quote unquote illegal DEI. Which isn't even, kind of changing their understanding of the law and how courts have opined. So I think there are a lot of other aspects of the ways in which the department is being used right now to pursue the kind of retribution agenda that I think has been deeply, deeply concerning and that we are living right now in real time.
And the job of the Justice Department is, first of all, at times to say, no, the law doesn't allow that. And second, we won't do that. And
well, yeah, and Mike, it's true. The department usually has internal actors that typically constrain the power of the executive branch and hold the executive branch kind of legally accountable. And you've got like the Office of Legal Counsel that is supposed to review all executive orders and presidential memoranda for that reason. We have heard that in this administration, the Office of Legal Counsel has been very sidelined. You've got the Civil Division that usually is, evaluating policy across the federal government for litigation risk and for, both legality, but also, what the consequences would be of the executive branch opining on any number of different issues. And you've seen massive resignations from across the department, in part because, and I have heard stories, and Peter has, I'm sure, heard other stories, the White House is literally directing the litigation of the department, directing both criminal prosecutions and civil litigation in an unprecedented manner, in a manner that was actually supposed to have been stopped after the Watergate crisis, with norms that were put in place that have existed, again, across Republican and Democratic administrations, and where line lawyers and career men and women who serve, across political administrations have been directed to do things that they have found to be both illegal, unconscionable, unethical. We have seen really high-profile resignations, and it's actually kind of gutted the department right now. But it has empowered a White House that is very much viewing the department not as an independent agency that needs to seek justice and do that independent evaluation, but truly just as a tool for the president.
Yeah, and I think this is something that it can be, I think, hard sometimes for people who haven't worked there to fully appreciate, because the Department of Justice really has two aspects to it, broadly speaking, that are at least a little bit in tension with one another. The first is that they are a cabinet department serving under the president, under an attorney general that the president appoints, and in broad policy strokes, they are part of his administration and are going to be coordinating on policy with other cabinet departments and the White House across a range of issues. And at the same time, there's always been this space in which the department regards itself as having an independent role to be faithful to the law. And the two biggest components of that space are, first, the view that the criminal justice process has to be apolitical, neutral, nonpartisan, just about the merits. And second, that it has to be able to give candid advice that is given effect to the president and the rest of the government about what is and is not within their power to do. And so there have been historic incidents along, many administrations in which ultimately the top leadership of the Department of Justice has either resigned or threatened to resign because the White House has sought to intrude on those two particular areas. You have, the Saturday Night Massacre under Nixon. You also had the surveillance controversy under President George W. Bush, in which the top leadership of the department said they would have to leave if the president continued to authorize a surveillance program that they had concluded was unlawful. And at the end of the first Trump term, you had the acting attorney general and the head of the Office of Legal Counsel and others say the entire top leadership of the department would resign if the president installed a hand-picked acting attorney general who would seek to overturn the election. And each time that happened, at least the latter two times it happened, the president backed down because even though he could have ultimately taken the resignations and done what he was going to do, the public reaction would have been so strong that it would have made it counterproductive. And so there's always been this space in which the department says, we are telling you can't do this, and we cannot stay if you insist on it. And it's held the line there. It is, frankly, for me, inconceivable that Pam Bondi or Kash Patel would ever tell the president, you could do this. You could get away with it. Maybe it would be secret. Maybe no court would ever hear the case. So you could actually get away with it tactically, but it would be wrong and it would be unlawful, and we can't stay if you're going to do that. That is a space that has been obliterated, I think, in the current administration.
And the very visible manifestation of that, of them standing with him in the guilt-encrusted Oval Office as he talks about who he wants prosecuted next. And we should, of course, mention the prosecution of James Comey and of Letitia James because it's so noteworthy, first of all, from what we know, both the professional line attorneys and prosecutors and the political appointees of the administration said, no, there's no case here in both instances. They were moved out of the way. We know that President Trump maybe sent a DM to Pam Bondi or in any case demanded that there be prosecution, and that the prosecution occurred in what looks like very flimsy, in both instances, remarkably flimsy legal basis. This seems like both selective prosecution and just in the process itself, a real abuse of power of a kind we haven't seen. Is really, the post-Watergate reforms came about in part because of the tremendous abuses of power during Watergate and under earlier administrations. But it's hard to come up with something quite as naked as that, at least from what we can see.
I mean, I think that's right. I think there's this has been pretty brazen. The installment of the president's own personal lawyers in the highest levels of the department and now replacing U.S. attorneys who tell the president or the attorney general that pursuing a particular prosecution is improper and would not meet the standards of the Justice Department, and then getting fired for doing that and being replaced by the president's loyalists. It's all happening in open daylight. This is not, as you said, the president posted a very public message demanding the pursuit of his enemies, et cetera. This is all happening in cold, plain daylight. There's nothing hidden about it. And I think the part of the challenge right now is, what is the oversight mechanism? Where is it? Obviously, apart from, does this compel, average voters to care about what's happening? That's one question. But we also have a Congress that has not been performing its typical function on oversight. And some of it may be, the shock and awe of all of it. But some of it is just that across the board, Congress has not played its particular, its particular oversight role. I mean, it is hard to imagine if you took any one of the hundreds of things that have happened with the department and the White House's deployment of the department for political agendas, any one of those would have dominated a news cycle for 4 months, would have created, hearings on the Hill, et cetera. And right now, there's just so much happening, and Congress is not playing that oversight function at all. So, and in fact, in some instances, is kind of has become part of the agenda. And so this is a very, very significant problem. So it's not that it's being hidden or people don't know what's happening. I think it's also hard sometimes for people outside of Washington or outside of the rule of law community to appreciate the danger, the kind of corrosive nature of what is happening at the department. It can seem kind of very DC focused, very inside baseball. And yet, back to our original point, when this happens, when the Justice Department gets kind of corroded in this way, it can have real implications for communities across the country, certainly for the legal system around the country, but I think also for the other very kind of bread and butter functions that the department performs, and most importantly, for the public's confidence in the institution writ large. I think we are seeing historic lows. People do not trust our institutions, and some of these institutions have been so core to the functioning of our government and our democracy. And there's just such a corrosion of faith and trust in our institutions when they get kind of used in this way. And that's going to be a much bigger, longer term challenge for the country, that in this very polarized landscape where the media ecosystem is polarized, where people don't have faith in their leaders and institutions, this is going to be, I think, one of the most difficult challenges for all of us facing forward in how to strengthen our democracy and restore and reform institutions that feel like they are corrupted or being motivated by politics rather than kind of the value set that we expect them to be motivated by.
And I want to talk about sort of what can be done right now to try to keep the Justice Department on the path it ought to be on, and what are some of the things after the wreckage that we ought to be thinking about in terms of Reconstruction. And Vanita, you're absolutely right. Part of the change is that the news media itself and its function is so changed and so degraded that we used to rely on journalists, in effect, to largely tell us what was a scandal and what wasn't. And now it's so fractured, it's so polarized, and that function isn't there. Peter, what are some of the things, and what are the responsibilities for people who are currently in the Justice Department, for attorneys and their professional responsibility? You've spoken out a lot about this very thing, including recently on 60 Minutes. What can people at the Justice Department be doing, and also what can Congress do, and what can the courts do right now?
Right. I mean, look, there are so many different actors who have to, examine what their own responsibilities and capabilities are. And certainly for the people who are inside the Justice Department and who are, struggling with, how they carry out their jobs in a professional manner in this kind of environment, those are really tough questions. I will say this, and it kind of relates to what the rest of us can do. And I'm indebted for this point to a fellow named Brendan Ballou, who was a line prosecutor on January 6th cases, but also worked in the Antitrust Division and the National Security Division. And, he wrote a piece some time ago in which he talked about working in the National Security Division during the first Trump term, when he and others around him were asked to do things that, that they had serious questions about and were trying to oppose internally. And one thing he said that has very much stayed with me is that, people on the outside, they think that it doesn't matter when they complain, when they protest, when they speak up. And he said, it matters. He said, for those of us who are inside trying to uphold the values and arguing at meetings and writing our memos, we're not the decision makers, but knowing that people outside are speaking up, they supply us with arguments, they supply us with courage. They mean we go to meetings and refuse to go along with some forced consensus. They mean we write memos alerting the decision makers to the ways in which what they're doing might violate the law or be dangerous policy. Maybe in some cases they become whistleblowers, as in the case you just mentioned involving Erosion and some of the deportation cases. And so his message was, people have more power outside than they think, but it is necessary that they speak up. And that's kind of where, we talk about Jim Comey. And the truth is, I am quite confident Jim Comey will never spend a day incarcerated. He will either get that indictment dismissed before trial because it's defective in so many ways, or he will win a trial because the charges are flimsy and made up in so many ways. But that's not really the point for the administration. I mean, if you really wanted a conviction here, You wouldn't publicly fire your U.S. attorney and hire someone completely inexperienced just to seek it. The message they want to send there is that people should just keep quiet, that it really has a cost to be an enemy of the administration. And so the effect is not just on one defendant, it's on everybody who gets that message and responds by holding back. And I will just say, I think we all see this, around us, the degree of reticence among people, the genuine fear that is out there. I talk to reporters who say they have never had this much trouble getting people to go on the record. And so there is a very systematic campaign of intimidation. It does work in part, but first and foremost, Michael, the first answer I would say is everybody has some degree of power just by speaking up, because that's contagious, and not speaking up is contagious too. So I think you don't need to have a position. You can write, you can speak, you can talk to your friends, and I think keeping that alive is extremely important.
And Peter and I have talked about this before. We were talking about it a lot when the law firm started capitulating to blatantly unconstitutional executive orders. And I think what has been so alarming, or what I couldn't have predicted, was the level of fear and lack of courage among not just kind of institutions, but their leaders living in that fear that Peter is describing. It's real. And part of it's real because the federal government actually has a lot of power over people's lives and the ability to ruin institutions and ruin individuals or to help them thrive. And so we get that. But what I think has been so heartening is that the flip side of that is that there are a lot of people that are really hard at work, and I can do a little plug for the Brennan Center here, and I know that we're all pro, but it's folks at the Brennan Center, it's folks at organizations around the country that have not cowed to the fear, that could be targeted, but also understand their value set and work every day is to protect and uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, and are in court on it. People organizing peaceful, nonviolent mobilizations like the No Kings rally, which I just thought was incredible. And, to see that type of people power, to Peter's point, of people saying and taking a stand to say this isn't okay. I think the media, I have been also impressed by some of the media that is doing this persistent drumbeat of documenting what is happening and giving life to the stories of people like Erosion and others, to make sure that we are listening, that it's not just getting lost. I think there are lots of folks in the department who remain. I mean, a lot of folks have left the department, obviously. And for example, the Civil Rights Division now, 75% to 80% of its staff is now no longer there. There are parts of the department, including at National Security, in the Civil Division, where we've seen massive departures, and it's really quite upsetting, but where you have a lot of the folks inside the department very heartened by, folks standing up. And I think this is really important. We forget it. And I think there's a fatigue and an exhaustion, which I completely understand. But there's also a need to kind of continue to document and call out the things that are just not okay, that are undermining the fabric of our country, that are undermining communities and people. And we can't allow ourselves to be complacent about that. And so we've got to continue to build that energy and support organizations that continue to hold the administration to account to the Constitution and to the rule of law.
And I would just add, it's obviously not realistic to think that today Congress is going to enact legislative reform. That's not right now in the cards. But it will be in the cards, one day. And there are so many things that we can learn from the current situation to do. And I'll just take, one example. Right now, the Justice Department is in court in a variety of places defending the president's deployment of forces of different sorts in different states and cities. And the president has intimated that he may well invoke something called the Insurrection Act, which would unlock even more emergency powers. Now, the Justice Department will have its job made much easier by the fact that we have a bunch of statutes which are written with a great deal of breadth and vagueness in giving the president the opportunity to do lots of things if he merely declares in his judgment that there's an emergency. Now, there are some checks on that, but they're poorly written into the law, and it's a challenging situation for the people who are seeking to contest those powers right now. But those are statutes, and they can be changed, and the Brennan Center has done just path-breaking work for years in identifying the problem there and proposing solutions. And one of the things that is just, a shame, and it's kind of indicative of a broader problem, is that even in the last administration, when there was a president and a House and Senate all under control of the same party, there was no real interest in doing anything about that. And part of that is that rule of law issues aren't sexy, and administrations tend to have more pressing agendas, and also that most presidents don't want to limit their own power. They think they're reasonable people and they should have as much discretion as possible. But look, I always think when you're talking about whether anyone in government should have a power, you should close your eyes and imagine how it would feel if your worst enemy had that power. And we need to have some more long-term thinking on behalf of our political branches when we get a chance to do that. When there's a Congress that would pass such legislation, to think about how we can write into law limits that will, at least in the future, prevent some of the things that we're experiencing now.
I think it's not too soon to be thinking about those things, because throughout American history, scandal is followed by reform. Not always, but when you have change, it comes after some very big demonstrable crack up. Vanita, how do you see this, and how do we overcome the general tendency that any administration has to say, well, we don't really want to write limits to our own activities into law?
Well, in some ways, I think that the degree of the crisis we're in, because it's unprecedented, forces our hand to actually do some of the thinking much earlier than we typically do. I mean, there's going to be a lot of questions about how do you even rebuild the government, right? There were a lot of ways in which when I was in government, there were inefficiencies, obstacles to getting things done, things that just felt like, our institutions were getting too corrupted, et cetera. That was real. I think that what DOJ did was basically take a bulldozer and destroy. The other way to respond to this is to engage in real reform and reconstruction, and how do you actually build institutions and rebuild the government to deserve the faith of the American people, and to take advantage of some of these structural reforms that Peter's alluding to, which are not at all sexy and not necessarily even as salient in people's lives as healthcare is, which is real, but which does have tremendous impact overall on all of the things that we care about. And so the thinking has to start now. And, just to personalize this, it's why I launched the Center for Law and Public Trust here at NYU Law School, is to be able to think now about what does it mean to build institutions where we may be in crisis at this moment, to think forward about building institutions that actually respect the rule of law and earn the trust of the American public. So what does it look like to have a Justice Department that can retain independence on criminal prosecutions, while, of course, as is always and should be the case, helping pursue the policy prerogatives of the president? What does it mean to have career men and women? What is it going to look like to rebuild the federal civil service and build it better? Nobody that I know thinks that rebuilding it to what it looked like before is actually the answer. So I actually think there's a lot of opportunity. And for me, it's a hopeful project, because a lot of what I do or have been doing is around the preventing or addressing abuse of power right now. This project of trying to think of rebuilding, reforming, reconstruction, I think is a very hopeful, forward-looking project, but it's one that we need to take really seriously. AI is going to transform and is transforming so much. We would have to do this regardless in some ways of the moment we're in, but it's both got the potential to make government so much more efficient, and we've got to deal with like mitigating the harms that will come with that vis-a-vis, let's just say, AI and law enforcement. How do we think about that in a constructive way? I think there's a lot of important questions for us to dig into, and we can't wait. We actually have to start now and understand what we don't know, bring in that expertise, and think all of this through, and strengthening where norms have been too weak or failed. As Peter said, yes, there may not be a Congress right now to pursue that agenda, but let's not be caught flat-footed and at the last moment having to construct that agenda in a moment where we should have given a lot more thought to what that would look like. And so I think that onus is on all of us to really, get involved in and start that work now.
Well, your project is so exciting for all the reasons you've just said. We need to think anew, in Lincoln's words, and need to be willing to look at the fact that, I think about Doge. It sort of was like popcorn. It had a kernel of insight puffed up beyond recognition. Government really does need to work better, and we have no choice but to reconstruct the Justice Department, but other parts of the government as well, for this current moment, reflecting both effectiveness and accountability. And it is an exciting prospect, and it's a prospect that is not going to be for one party or another. We mentioned the post-Watergate reforms. They were really instituted more than anything else by President Gerald Ford and his Attorney General Edward Levy after his fellow Republican president resigned, Richard Nixon. This has become something that, done right, can bring people together from across the political spectrum. We at the Brennan Center will do what we can to be helpful. We just published a paper about the internal checks and balances at the Justice Department and how they can be effectively addressed, and much more. But I think you've both really laid out how important it is that this vital, powerful, potentially dangerous institution be set on the right track. And we're really grateful to both of you for what you do, for the voices you lend to this, for your expertise, and for giving all of us hope. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank
Pleasure
you,
to be
Michael.
here.
Thank you.
Well, I'm new to podcasting, but I think it's a very exciting way to have these conversations, and we hope you think so as well. If you enjoy this program, please give us a boost by liking it, by subscribing, and sharing it with your friends. That's the best way to get the word out. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please give us a 5-star rating. We would be very grateful. Thanks.